This is Cami Westall with a review of Chapter 15, a very condensed version of the Civil War, a war for Union and Emancipation, as it is subtitled. So the chapter, begins mentioning Lincoln elected as a Republican in 1860, and the inevitable role that would have in secession, not succession with a C, with SU, but secession with an SE at the beginning of it there. The people in the South worried that a Republican would have it in mind to free the slaves in slavery, since the Republicans were an anti-slavery party. It wasn't, as you read in Chapter 14, not so much that they were these great moralists who realized the human evils of keeping people in bondage, but they felt, many of the Republicans, that having slavery eliminated jobs for poor whites. So Lincoln is sworn in. He says specifically in his inauguration that he's not going to outlaw slavery, but as soon as he is elected, before that even transpires, South Carolina, good old home state of ours, leads the way in seceding in December of 1860. So Abbeville takes pride, still got a statue downtown of being the first county to agree, and the rest of the counties went along with secession. So they withdraw from the Union. So for a little while, South Carolina, we were actually our own little republic before other states joined us. But within a few months, the Confederate States, or the Confederacy, is formed in February of 1861, when other states join in. Originally, the capital was Montgomery, Alabama, but when Virginia seceded later, the capital would move to Richmond, Virginia. So it talks about secession, the president of the Confederacy being Jefferson Davis, and already the South is in a tough place because they were talking about states' rights, having a less intrusive federal government, although it was mainly the state right to have slaves. But if you're talking about having less federal government and you get involved in a war, as they pretty much assume that they will be entangled in, then that means you need a stronger central government. So they're in kind of a catch-22 from the beginning. But this war will get started, as it mentions on page 420, at Fort Sumter. They are in Charleston on April the 12th. So we just had the sesquicentennial, huge long word, for the 150th anniversary last year at Fort Sumter there. And what happens here is this was a fort that was under federal control. If you've been in Charleston, it sits out in the harbor there. It was controlled by a man named Major Robert Anderson. But when a supply line comes in, then General Beauregard and the Charlestonians fire on the fort, seizing control of it. So the fort is bombed away. They're firing all kinds of rockets there towards the fort. The Union Army will retreat. They raise the white flag to surrender there. And the South has won this first battle. This is what inspired other states to join, like Virginia and North Carolina and Tennessee. So that's when the capital will then later move to Richmond. Then goes into the excitement of the war. It mentions a comment before they had parking lots, because there were no cars yet. Benjamin Wade talking about making the South a desert instead of a parking lot, by blowing it to smithereens. Then goes into slaves from the South, understandably feeling like this might be a war that would result in their freedom, even though it is not initially so much about slavery, but Lincoln's role is wanting to keep the government, keep the Union together. That's his main initial goal. Goes into some of the strategies there on 422, 423. One of the Union strategy of the blockade, described on 422, or the anaconda, like a giant snake Winfield Scott said they would sort of squeeze the South out of supplies. Again, the South is not very industrial. They relied on shipping a lot to get manufactured goods, to get food products that didn't grow there. So a Union blockade preventing Southerners from access to goods from their port cities. The first real land battle, marked with a Confederate flag for a Confederate victory here, occurred at Bull Run, also known as Manassas, or Manassas Junction, there in July of 1861. A major victory for the Confederates. The Union troops were not in good shape for this war. They fled and ran and ran and ran on the way out. This is where General Thomas Jackson famously got the name of Stonewall Jackson for the Confederacy. So Northerners realized at this point that the war might not be as quick as everyone thought it would be, because they certainly had a good bit of training that they would need to do. After that, it talks a little bit more about the Confederacy, the rule of the Constitution there. Again, more of a one-party system in the South, mentioned on page 426. There were still, which was primarily the Democratic Party. There were other parties in the North, if you remember people like Stephen Douglas, a Democrat who wasn't as pro-slavery as some of the people in the South who were Democrats. So the North had more of a two-party system, the South more of a one-party system. Mentions the supremacy, one of the major advantages that the Union had in their naval forces. Not only were they able to enact the blockade, but you had the famous Battle of the Ironclads, the Merrimack, or known to the Southerners as the Virginia, fighting against the Monitor there at the Battle of Hampton Roads in Virginia. Battle where here was an image from one of the Ironclads, huge sort of prehistoric submarines fighting there. The Monitor sank off the coast of North Carolina, and it's something that they've been trying to restore in recent years. So the North had a major advantage there. The Southern advantages included the fact that since a lot of the war was fought in the South, they knew the land well. They had very sound generals in Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. They needed fewer supply lines because they had supplies there present in the South. So the defensive positioning was something that would help them throughout the war. 1862, slavery is becoming more of an issue. I mentioned some about the economy of slavery, but these battles are becoming a little more ferocious. So a lot more battles being fought in the Tennessee area, Arkansas, places known as the Western Theater, because it was sort of on the west side of where the battle took place. A lot of Union victories occurred there at that time. So the Union forces are gaining land over on the west. They're also pushing up from capturing New Orleans and able to move on up the Mississippi River. So some major advantages there, and some strong generals, men like Ulysses S. Grant. Oops, didn't mean to get there that fast. Meanwhile, in the east, so the area that would be more appear around Virginia, usually when it's talking about the Eastern Theater, it's here in primarily Virginia, but also North Carolina, South Carolina a little bit. George McClellan is the U.S. general, and Lincoln and this George McClellan guy, they really have a time. McClellan is not as aggressive as Lincoln wants him to be. Lincoln wants him to destroy Robert E. Lee's forces. Basically what happens is, time and time again, George McClellan will win a victory, but he stops short of really taking out Robert E. Lee's troops. So those troops live to fight again. They live to fight another day, in essence. And so Lincoln is very frustrated with George McClellan. And so that's an ongoing problem before he will finally release McClellan of his duties. And that happens after the battle at Antietam, also sometimes called Sharpsburg, which occurs in Maryland in September of 1862. This was the bloodiest day of fighting. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle in the entire Civil War, but it lasted for 3 days. There at Antietam, you had a very depressing and bloody day in September of 1862. And on September 17th. That battle wasn't really a victory for either side because Lee turned around, but once again, McClellan did not pursue Robert E. Lee. McClellan did not go after him. But this was also a timing where Lincoln said, okay, there needs to be something different. We need to try to win more support for this war if it's ever going to come to an end. And partly out of strategy, he then announces that the Emancipation Proclamation will go into effect after 1863. So it's right after the Battle of Antietam that Lincoln announces the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, this was Lincoln's intention all along had been to keep the Union together. The Emancipation Proclamation does not free slaves everywhere. Lincoln did not free the slaves in the border states. The border states were slave states that decided to join with the North instead of with the South. He didn't free slaves there. He didn't free slaves in places in the South that Union troops had already captured. So in essence, he didn't free the slaves in places where he had control. He just said that the slaves would be freed in the rebellious states where he didn't have authority. So it didn't have much of an effect in terms of freedom, but it was very, very symbolic that this was a transition period where the war did become more about slavery and not just about those rebellious southern states trying to leave the Union. You had many more black soldiers join the war effort. This was beneficial. They still weren't treated fairly in the North. They were given less pay, and usually they had bad jobs. They might be put on the front lines, if you've seen the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick. But if you were put on the front lines, then you were basically assured of being killed. They might serve as cooks. This is a telling image of African Americans having to clean a battlefield, remove the remains of soldiers who had fought there, in a chilling image. But still, the war is symbolically becoming about slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. There are more slave refugees to the north. Then goes some into the war at home, all of the casualties, people becoming increasingly anti-war. A lot of men who in the North who did not want to. Again, we didn't have great moral examples all the time. There were a lot of men who refused to fight for a war on slavery. But the war continues on. In 1863, several key battles in Virginia. Stonewall Jackson killed at Chancellorsville. That's a major blow for the Confederacy. Then you get up to Gettysburg, where Lee invades the North for the last time. Goes to Pennsylvania. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. Terrible decisions made in Pickett's charge, mentioned on page 442. Lee never really forgave himself for what happened there at Gettysburg with Pickett's charge, but they quickly come back to the South, and it's pretty much it has been a bad year for the South, and it doesn't get better after that. There's lots more discontent, as mentioned. Also, thanks to the Western theater, Lincoln finally finds an aggressive general, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant will be brought over to head the Army of the Potomac, fighting against Robert E. Lee in Virginia for the Eastern Theater. You had William Tecumseh Sherman, also a Union general, fighting in the South, famously marching to the sea, burning down Atlanta, so destroying Atlanta in 1864, then marching on with ruthless troops. They did some horrible things. Even a lot of blacks who initially were excited about Union forces coming remarked on how horrible they felt after seeing Sherman's troops in action. If they needed food, they might slaughter a live animal before even killing him, like a horse, and just take out chunks of the animal for meat. Destroyed the railroads, captured Savannah, moved up to Columbia. This is why if you go to downtown Columbia, it's a planned city. The roads are square. They're in some other word for that. They're in a square format. They don't go all over in random places, and that's because Columbia and Atlanta had to be rebuilt after that. So the second half of 1863, all through 1864 into 1865, things are bad for the South. And finally, at Appomattox Courthouse, there in the center of Virginia, in April of 1865, on April 9th, Robert E. Lee is forced to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant, effectively ending the war. Jefferson Davis remained on the run for a little while, actually went to Abbeville, the Burke Stark mansion there in Abbeville, trying to rally support, saying we can still win this. He is ultimately captured, but the war effectively came to an end on April 9th when Robert E. Lee surrendered. Grant was very gracious to him, allowed Lee's soldiers to take their horses home with them, knowing they would probably need horses to do their farming. Gave them food rations because many of them were very hungry by that time. And tragically, Lincoln only has a couple of days, 5 days, to celebrate this before John Wilkes Booth kills him at Ford's Theater on the video that you watched for your video quiz. So over 600,000 men died from disease and bloodshed in a war where it would be difficult to put things back together again in Humpty Dumpty fashion. So perhaps too quick for justification for the war, but again, that is a brief overview of what happens and what is recorded in Chapter 15.